Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, according to Luke.
Glory be to thee, O Lord.
When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, Jesus said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." They asked him, "Teacher, when will this be, and what will be the sign that this is about to take place?" And he said, "Beware that you are not led astray. For many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and the time is near. Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end will not follow immediately." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and plagues, and there will be dreadful portents and great signs from heaven. But before all this occurs, they will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify. So make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance. For I will give you words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, by relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance you will gain your souls." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise be to thee, O Christ.
In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Amen.
If you were with us on All Saints, I explained then that we are now in a little mini season of the church that is celebrated from All Saints' Day through Christ the King Sunday. As we move through this final month of our liturgical year, our readings have turned towards a consideration of the coming reign of Christ, the time when Jesus will return in his kingly power. These final weeks of the church year mark what a friend of mine, Ken Carradine, calls the eschatide, based on the term eschaton, which refers to the day when Christ will return in glory to assume his rightful place as king. My friend likes to point out that this is a time of year then when we are focusing on the end of time, or at least on the end of time as we know it. So this little unmarked season is a time in the life of the church when we are consciously considering last things and considering them in light of what really matters in our lives. As we come to the end of the season after Pentecost, and we are about to embark on the Advent season and on a new church year, we find that in this brief time, it's only a few weeks from All Saints' Day to Christ the King Sunday, we are brought to a high place, a precipice, if you will. And we are looking off into not into what has been or what is. We are looking off into what will be. What will be when Christ comes again in his kingly power and all things are made new. It's an opportunity for us to consider our lives today in light of what is to come. And this is where we've been brought today in terms of our gospel reading, which brings Luke's gospel to a full circle in terms of our liturgical year. I couldn't even remember this. I had to look back to it. But where we began the liturgical year, Advent 1, 2015, was actually the tail end of this chapter, the end of this conversation with Jesus. Now, next Sunday, of course, Christ the King is technically the culmination of the church year. And our gospel reading next week will be once more from Luke's gospel. But this reading is actually the end of the year. We began the church year in the Advent season with predictions of the coming of the Son of Man in his kingly power. And here we end the church year with the same sorts of predictions. Now, why? Why does it matter for us to circle around like this? It's because our Christian hope begins and ends with our understanding that this world is impermanent, that these travails are temporary. All of us, all who have gone before and all who will come after, we are not of this world. We are of the world that is to come. That's the reason we recognize this little season of eschaton. And so, just so, last week in his conversation with the Sadducees, Jesus explained through a discussion of marriage that what the coming reign of Christ will be is something that is not at all a thing that we can quantify or qualify in human terms. It's something far greater. And this week, Jesus uses as example the marvelous, seemingly indestructible temple complex built by Herod the Great to explain that, yes, even this great temple is impermanent, that at a time which we cannot know on this side of the age to come, everything will be swept away and be made new. That's something that must have boggled the minds of the disciples, as would have this talk of signs and portents. But something in Jesus' words would soon become all too familiar to them. For the disciples would soon be well acquainted with the notion of arrests and persecutions, of being handed over and being brought before kings and governors. They would become well acquainted with the notion of suffering for the sake of Jesus Christ. And Jesus' one instruction to them and to us in this passage is that all of this suffering that they were about to endure for his name and for his gospel will give them the opportunity to testify. I like to think that this may have been one of the sayings of Jesus to which the disciples would look back as they were sitting in prison, look back and remember as they went through the known world, testifying and suffering for Christ, that this is exactly what Jesus had told them to expect. So we have to marvel at the message of Jesus, something that was so profound that these men and women would be willing to be betrayed by their loved ones for it, even to suffer death for it. When some say that this is just a fanciful lie, I like to point out that people don't suffer persecution for a lie. People aren't willing to die for something that they've simply made up. They're going to let go of it long before that happens. Our self-preservation runs far too deep. So, what was this message that was so radical that these men and women were willing to testify in the face of such great odds? It's not what you think. It's never really what we think. About 15 years ago, I heard the most important sermon of my life in Birmingham, Alabama. It was preached by none other than the Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Now, here's a man who knows what it means to testify to the message of Jesus Christ in the face of persecutions and sufferings, and the constant threat of betrayal and dying for the sake of this message. And so he sought to share this message with us that day. And he said that most people think what Jesus was trying to convey through his ministry is that we are all equals. And we are. But that's not what Jesus was teaching. Think about it. If we are only equals, if you and I are simply equals, then I can say to you, fine, you're my equal. Now go away. Leave me alone. Jesus didn't say that. Jesus said something that is much more. He didn't say we're simply equals. Jesus said that we are family. Now think about what that means. Family can disagree. Family can't walk away from each other. Family has to endure and support each other. Family means putting everything in the same pot and sharing one another's fate, no matter what may come. Family ultimately means loving one another. And in Christian terms, this idea of family is more than just the family gathered here in the house of God this morning. It means all the believers in Jesus Christ everywhere. But actually it means more than that. God so loved the world, John 3:16. This kind of love, this kind of family means the human family. It means those with whom we may disagree fundamentally. It means those with whom we may disagree politically. It means those whom we may label not like us. I had an experience earlier this year of what it means in its outermost extremity to be a family. An experience that is probably more in line with Bishop Tutu's understanding of the term than our postmodern, 21st century American Western view of it. Some of you know that I traveled to Istanbul, Turkey earlier this year to work with a friend on a project highlighting the Syrian refugee crisis. While I was there, through a local government official, we were introduced to a Syrian family that was willing to be interviewed by us about their escape from Aleppo and their current living situation in Istanbul. The culmination of the project is a YouTube video that seeks to encourage faithful Muslims and Christians everywhere to find ways of working together in love to address the Syrian crisis. And so that night, as we arrived at the Syrian family's home with camera crew and interpreter, we had to go down 2 basement levels below the ground to get to where they were living. It was a dingy, dark, tiny, 1-bedroom apartment 20 feet below the ground. And there we were greeted by the grandmama and grandpapa of the family, along with 3 small children. Through our Arabic interpreter, we learned that there were actually 15 family members living cramped together in this tiny apartment. The rest were out, we were told. We later learned that they were all out begging for food and money, whatever they could come up with to keep the family going. Through the course of our time together, they shared with us all that they had suffered in leaving Aleppo and making their way to Istanbul, and all that they were still suffering in Istanbul because of the lack of jobs and the crush of refugees. But what came through that evening actually surprised me. It wasn't what you think. It was an unexpected happiness that they shared. These people were incredibly happy. They were still together. They had endured and survived, and they were confident that they would go on as a family, each giving what they could and each receiving what they needed. It was clear, abundantly clear to all of us, that the source of their happiness was their love for one another. Now, in global terms, Jesus was born and brought up a stone's throw from Aleppo. His experience of family life was probably much more like this Syrian family than our understanding of family. And I believe this is why Jesus' disciples were able to endure all things, because they were a loving family. And 2,000 years later, we are still called to be and live into being this loving family. So, not just this morning in this house of God, but as we go out into the world this week, let's take care of one another. Let's bear each other in love. We may not have left our homes in the midst of civil war, but we're not immune to suffering. We may not agree with each other. We may have deep divisions, but we are still called to love one another. I pray that we may know the happiness of loving one another always, always, as he loved us, because he loved us even unto death for us upon the cross.